One rainy night, a businessman finds a mysterious young woman wounded in an alley. Taking her to his mansion, he discovers hidden secrets from his own family that connect him to her in unimaginable ways. Can they face the shadows of the past together before it's too late? The rain was falling hard, pounding the asphalt of the city as Richard Bennett hurriedly walked to his car. He had finished a long day at the office, and all he wanted was the warmth of his home. But a peculiar sound, almost drowned out by the rumble of the storm, made him stop. It was a moan. Intrigued, Richard turned his head towards a narrow, dark alleyway. Shadows danced in the dim light of a flickering street lamp. But that was where he saw her, a young woman hunched against the wall, soaked and shivering. Her clothes were torn and her face hidden by strands of wet hair. "Are you okay?" Richard asked, approaching cautiously. The girl looked up, revealing eyes filled with distrust and exhaustion. There was a cut on her forehead, and her pale skin was evident from extreme cold. Before she could respond, her knees gave way. Richard reacted quickly, catching her before she fell to the ground. "I'm going to help you, don't worry," he said firmly, trying to convey calm. Without waiting for an answer, he carefully picked her up and carried her to his carriage. During the drive to the Bennett mansion, Richard glanced at the stranger. There was something about her presence that made him uneasy, as if a shadow of sadness enveloped her. Upon arrival, Thomas, the family's faithful butler, greeted them with a mixture of surprise and concern. "Mr. Bennett, who is she?" he asked as he opened the front door. "I don't know yet. I found her on the street, injured. She needs immediate attention." Thomas nodded and hurried off to prepare a guest room while Richard placed the young woman in an armchair in front of the fireplace. The warmth of the fire was beginning to restore color to her face. Richard then noticed the small scars on her hands, signs of a hard life. "Can you tell me your name?" he asked in a soft voice. The young woman stared at him before murmuring, "Sophia." "It's okay, Sophia. Rest. You'll be safe here." Thomas returned with bandages and warm water. Together, they cleaned the wound on her forehead. Though Sophia remained silent, her eyes wandered around the room, taking in the shelves filled with books and the luxurious furnishings. The Bennett mansion, with its high ceilings and Victorian details, was a completely different world from the one she knew. "You should rest, sir." "I'll take care of everything," Thomas suggested, but Richard shook his head. "I can't leave her alone. Something tells me her story is more complicated than it seems." During the night, as Sophia slept soundly in the room assigned to her, Richard couldn't stop thinking about what had happened. He walked down the hall to his study, where he stopped in front of an old photo album that had always been there, ignored. Driven by an inexplicable curiosity, he opened it. The pictures showed happy moments of his family, but one in particular caught his attention. A woman he recognized as Evelyn Bennett, his mother, standing over a little girl. There was something about that little girl that seemed eerily familiar. Heart racing, she closed the album. There were many unanswered questions, and a growing sense that Sophia was connected to her past. For now, the storm outside was beginning to subside, but inside the mansion, echoes of forgotten secrets were just beginning to stir. The light of dawn filtered through the heavy curtains of the Bennett mansion, bathing the room in a soft, golden glow. Richard had spent the night awake, unable to get the image found in the photo album out of his mind. As he walked down the stairs to the living room, Thomas was already waiting for him with a cup of hot tea as usual. "How is Sophia?" Richard asked as he sat down on the couch. "You have slept soundly, sir. I believe the quietness of this house has been beneficial to you," replied the butler in his usual calm tone. Richard nodded, though his mind was elsewhere. Something about the photograph disturbed him deeply. Determined, he returned to the study, where the album remained on the desk, just as he had left it. He opened it again, observing every detail of the image that had so disturbed him. Evelyn Bennett, her mother, stood in the center, wearing a warm, motherly expression that Richard vaguely remembered. But beside her, a little girl of about 5 was looking at her with a shy smile. Her eyes, large and dark, were unmistakable. They were the same eyes he had seen the night before at Sophia's. A chill ran down his spine. What connection could there be between his mother and this unknown young woman? Richard knew that Evelyn had been a reserved woman, full of secrets that she never shared even with her own children. But this photograph hinted at something deeper, something he was determined to discover. At that moment, Thomas entered the study carrying a tray with breakfast. "Thomas," Richard said, holding up the photograph, "can you explain this to me?" The butler approached, his eyes resting on the image. For a brief moment, Richard noticed a flash of recognition in his gaze, but Thomas quickly returned to his neutral expression. "It's an old photo of Mrs. Evelyn," he said calmly, though his tone held a slight tension. "I'm not sure who the girl is." "Thomas, don't lie to me. I know that look. What do you know?" The silence that followed was heavy. Thomas, always a loyal and prudent man, seemed torn between his duty and his conscience. Finally, he set the tray down on the desk and looked Richard straight in the eyes. "Mr. Bennett, there are things that are perhaps best left in the past." "That's not an answer," Richard said firmly. "If this has anything to do with my mother, I have a right to know." Thomas sighed deeply, as if carrying the weight of decades of secrets. But before he could respond, a faint sound from the hallway interrupted them. They both turned their heads and saw Sophia, standing in the doorway, pale and confused. "What's going on?" he asked in a hoarse voice, his eyes filled with concern. The silence that followed was a promise that answers would not be long in coming. The morning air was cool and calm inside the Bennett mansion, but Sophia felt a crushing weight on her chest. Despite Richard's warm welcome and attempts to make her feel safe, something inside her told her she had to leave. She didn't trust him, Thomas, or this luxurious house that seemed too perfect. For someone accustomed to the harshness of the street, the mansion was an unreal place, almost a trap. Sophia took advantage of the silence of the house to explore. She walked carefully through the halls, observing the antique furniture, the framed portraits, and the books that filled the shelves. Everything was so different from what she knew that she felt out of place, like an intruder in a world where she didn't belong. However, her eyes stopped at a half-open door. From there, she could see the back gardens. She moved quickly. If she could make it to the garden, she could find a way out. The mansion was large, but she was confident in her ability to disappear. Barefoot so as not to make noise, she descended the stairs and crossed the kitchen, where she found a back door. When she opened it, a blast of cold air hit her. The humidity from the previous night's storm permeated the air. Sophia walked along the gravel path, feeling the stones hurt her feet. She didn't care. She just wanted to get out of there. But before she reached the gate, she heard a firm voice behind her. "Where do you think you're going?" Sophia stopped dead in her tracks. She turned slowly and saw Richard, standing a few feet away, his arms crossed. His expression was not angry but worried. "I can't stay here," Sophia said defensively. "This isn't for me." "You're not here because I want to impose something," Richard replied, approaching cautiously. "You're here because you need help. You don't have to trust me, but you should at least give yourself a chance to rest." Sophia looked at him, assessing him. There was sincerity in his words, but her instincts still told her that staying close to him was dangerous. "Why do you care?" and she asked, almost challenging him. Richard sighed, letting his guard down a bit. "Because I think your story is connected to mine. I don't know how or why, but I want to find out. And if that means helping you remember who you are or where you came from, I'm willing to do that." Sophia hesitated. Something in the intensity of his voice unsettled her. Finally, she looked down and murmured, "I don't know if I can trust you." "I'm not asking you to trust me right away," Richard said, "but at least stay a little longer. If you decide to leave later, I won't stop you." The silence between them was heavy, but Sophia finally nodded. Richard stepped back, allowing her space to decide. She slowly made her way back to the mansion, but not without taking her eyes off the back, as if she was still ready to run. The atmosphere at the Bennett mansion was calmer that evening. Sophia had resigned herself to staying a little longer, though her thoughts were still a whirlwind of doubts. For his part, Richard was determined to unravel the mysteries surrounding the young woman. The photograph he had found the night before was only the beginning, and he felt that the album held more answers than he imagined. "Sophia, can I show you something?" Richard asked as he approached the living room where she was sitting, staring into the flames of the fireplace. She looked up, a little suspicious, but nodded. Richard placed the album on the table and slowly opened it. The first page showed familiar pictures. his mother, Evelyn, smiling alongside other family members at formal events. But it was as he turned to the next pages that the details began to change. "Do you recognize anything?" Richard asked, pointing to a specific photograph. Sophia frowned. The picture showed Evelyn standing in front of an old building, holding hands with the same little girl from the other photo. Behind them, a faded sign read St. Clair's Orphanage. "That place, it feels familiar," Sophia murmured, touching the photograph carefully, as if the simple touch could trigger a buried memory. Richard watched her reaction closely. "It's an orphanage. Could you have been there?" Sophia shook her head slowly. "I don't know. Everything is blurry. But I think I've seen that building before." Intrigued, Richard flipped through the next few pages. Each photograph seemed to tell a fragmented story. There were images of Evelyn delivering packages at the entrance of the orphanage, hugging little children, and even some handwritten notes on the backs of the photos. One in particular caught both of their attention. It was a group portrait of children from the orphanage. In the background, barely visible, was a stern-looking man with a rigid expression. His presence seemed out of place. "Who could he be?" Richard asked, but Sophia remained silent, lost in her thoughts. It was then that Thomas entered the room with his silent gait. Seeing the open album on the table, his face tensed slightly, but he didn't say anything. "Thomas, do you know this place?" Richard asked, pointing to the photograph of the orphanage. The butler hesitated, but finally replied, "That's the orphanage where Mrs. Evelyn used to do charity work. She was very close to the children there, especially one little girl." Richard and Sophia exchanged glances. The connection was beginning to take shape, though there were still many missing pieces. "What happened to that place?" Richard insisted. "It was closed down many years ago, sir. But if you want answers, perhaps it is time for you to visit it yourself." The idea seemed to resonate with Sophia. Though fear still gripped her, something inside her pushed her to confront this lost fragment of her past. With the image of the orphanage in mind, they both knew that would be their next stop. The old structure of St. Clair's Orphanage loomed on the horizon like a giant forgotten by time. Broken windows and moss-covered walls spoke of years of neglect, but it still held a solemn air, as if the memories of those who once lived there refused to fade away. Richard parked the car in front of the rusty gate, and they both got out in silence. Sophia looked at the building with a mixture of anxiety and curiosity. Something about the place seemed eerily familiar, though she couldn't quite put her finger on why. "Are you sure you want to come in?" Richard asked, noticing her expression. Sophia took a deep breath before nodding. "Yes, I need to know what this place means." They pushed open the gate with difficulty, the creaking metal echoing in the cold air. Entering, an overgrown path led them to the main entrance. The wooden doors, partially fallen, revealed a gloomy, debris-filled interior. The smell of damp and dust permeated the air. "Be careful," Richard warned as he turned on a flashlight he had brought. The interior of the building was a labyrinth of empty rooms, with broken furniture and papers scattered on the floor. Yet every corner seemed to carry an emotional weight. Sophia walked slowly, observing the walls decorated with faded children's paintings. This looks familiar," he said quietly, stopping in front of a corner where pictures of children hung in frames made of weathered wood. Richard walked over. The pictures were blurred by time, but in one he saw a face that looked familiar. Evelyn Bennett, surrounded by a group of children. The same little girl from the album photos was there, holding Evelyn's hand tightly. "It's her again," Richard murmured, pointing at the picture. Sophia stared, and for a moment her breathing quickened. I think it's me." Richard's heart raced. Although Sophia still didn't remember clearly, the pieces seemed to fit together. They continued exploring until they came to a dilapidated office. Among the messy papers, they found a file marked with the orphanage's seal. Inside, there were detailed documents about the children who had lived there. "Here's your name," Richard said, holding a sheet of paper with shaking hands. "Sophia Kane. Date of entry, March 12, 2010. Sophia took the paper, her eyes scanning the words as if trying to bring back lost memories. But another name caught both of their attention. Evelyn Bennett, mentioned as a guardian and chief benefactor. "Your mother knew me," Sophia whispered, unable to hide her shock. Before they could fully process the information, a noise from the hallway made them turn. Both of them went on alert. Quick footsteps approached, and a figure emerged from the shadows. A robust man with a stern face and piercing eyes. "Looking for something?" he said in a deep voice. Richard stepped forward, placing Sophia behind him. "Who are you?" "Victor Kane," the man replied with a sinister smile. "And it seems that they have been snooping where they shouldn't." The name hit her like a blow. Sophia recoiled, her stomach tightening. Though she didn't fully remember Victor, something about his presence made her feel viscerally afraid. "Leave the girl alone," Richard demanded, facing the man. Victor laughed. "Not so fast, Bennett. This isn't your battle, but if you want answers, you better be prepared to face them." Without further ado, Victor disappeared into the shadows, leaving both of them in a state of uncertainty and tension. Now more than ever, Sophia and Richard knew they were at the center of a dangerous game. The departure from the orphanage was hurried. Richard and Sophia barely exchanged words as they made their way back to the car, their minds caught up in the implied threat of Victor Kane. The night air was thick, charged with a palpable tension that made every shadow seem like imminent danger. "We're not safe here," Richard said, adjusting the rearview mirror as he started the engine. Sophia sat in the passenger seat, staring out the window, lost in her thoughts. The pieces of her past were beginning to fall into place, but each answer seemed to bring with it new questions. As the car continued through the deserted streets, the lights of another vehicle began to shine brightly behind them. Richard frowned and accelerated. "They're following us," he murmured, his voice filled with concern. Sophia turned her head back and saw a black car approaching quickly. Her heart began to pound. "What do we do?" he asked, clinging to the seat. "Stay strong. I won't let them catch up to us." Richard's car took a sharp turn onto a side street, but the vehicle behind them followed closely. The chase took them through narrow alleys and dark avenues, tires screeching at every turn. "They're going to catch us," Sophia exclaimed as the enemy car came dangerously close. Richard gritted his teeth, desperately searching for a way out. Finally, he spotted a narrow bridge up ahead. If he could cross it, he might be able to throw them off the scent. "Hold on," he warned as he accelerated. The car sped across the bridge, barely avoiding the light poles and railings. Behind them, the black vehicle momentarily lost control, giving Richard and Sophia a few crucial seconds to gain distance. As they left the bridge, Richard turned into an abandoned parking lot and turned off the car's lights. They both held their breath as they watched the enemy car drive past. "Are you okay?" Richard asked, turning to Sophia. She nodded, though her hands were visibly shaking. "Who are they? What do they want from me?" "Victor Kane isn't playing around," Richard replied seriously. "He obviously loves you for something, but I don't know what." Before they could continue, a soft noise behind the car startled them. It was Thomas, who had arrived in another vehicle. "Mr. Bennett, we need to talk," she said, her tone urgent. "Thomas, how did you find us?" Richard asked, getting out of the car. The butler looked at Sophia with a mixture of concern and determination. "Because I know what is at stake. There are things I have not told you. Things I cannot hide anymore." Richard frowned. "What are you talking about?" Thomas took a deep breath before letting out the words they both needed to hear. "Evelyn Bennett had a secret daughter, and I think that daughter is Sophia." The silence that followed was overwhelming. Sophia, paralyzed, stared at Thomas in disbelief. "That can't be true," she whispered. "It is," Thomas continued. "Evelyn confided in me years ago. She left you at the orphanage to protect you from Victor Kane. He had threatened to destroy the Bennett family if Evelyn did not comply with his demands." Richard closed his eyes, trying to process what he had just heard. The connection between Sophia and her mother was now undeniable. But before they could argue further, Sophia spoke up, her voice shaking with emotion. "So, she abandoned me? Why did she never come back for me?" Thomas looked down. "He wanted to, but he died before he could face Victor. His sacrifice was to keep you safe." Sophia put her hands to her face, fighting a mixture of pain and confusion. Richard, touched, put a hand on her shoulder. "You're not alone, Sophia. We're going to solve this together." The determination in his words was enough to give Sophia a small spark of hope. But deep down, they both knew that Victor's threat was not over yet. The Bennett mansion was enveloped in an eerie silence. Sophia stood in the living room, watching the flames dance in the fireplace. Her mind was a whirlwind of thoughts and emotions. Thomas's revelation had left a void she could not easily fill. Was it true that Evelyn Bennett, the woman in the photographs, had been her mother? Richard, sitting in the armchair across from her, held a worn journal he had found among Evelyn's belongings. He had decided to look through it, searching for answers in his mother's words. "There's something here," Richard said, breaking the silence. Sophia looked up, curious but still wary. Richard read aloud. "The threat of Victor Kane hangs over us like a shadow. I cannot risk him discovering the truth. My daughter will be safer away from here, even if my heart breaks with this decision." Sophia felt the air leave her lungs. The confirmation in those words was overwhelming. For the first time, she began to accept that Evelyn had truly been her mother, and that she had left her behind not out of a lack of love, but to protect her. "She loved me," Sophia murmured, more to herself than to Richard. "More than you can imagine," he replied, closing the journal and placing it on the table. "But now we have to figure out how to stop Victor before he does more damage." Sophia nodded slowly, though her mind was immersed in fragments of memories that were beginning to emerge. Vague flashes of a dark-haired woman singing a lullaby, a scent of jasmine enveloping her as warm hands caressed her hair, but also the echo of screams and the stern face of a man she now knew was Victor. "I remember things. Not everything, but bits and pieces," Sophia said, hugging her legs as she searched for the right words. "I remember his voice, his laugh, but I also remember fear. A lot of fear." Richard listened to her in silence, allowing her to unburden her thoughts. He knew that the fragmented memories were only the beginning of a much deeper and more painful truth. "Sophia, whatever Victor's after, we can't let him get it," Richard said finally, with a firmness in his voice she hadn't noticed before. "This mansion, my mother, everything is connected. But I need you to trust me so we can face this together." Sophia looked at him, and for the first time in days, she felt a spark of confidence well up inside her. She nodded slowly, though her emotions were still in turmoil. "I trust you, Richard, but this won't be easy." "It never is," he replied, offering her an encouraging smile. As the hours ticked by, the two began to plan their next move, knowing that the shadows of the past would soon catch up with them again. However, amidst the painful memories and uncertainties of the present, a new strength seemed to emerge in Sophia. A determination born from the desire to reclaim the life that Victor and fate had taken from her. The night was cold and silent as Richard and Sophia walked down the long concrete hallway leading to the abandoned factory. They had received a cryptic message from Victor Kane with an address and a clear threat. If they wanted answers, they had to come alone. Sophia clenched her fists, trying to control the fear that was growing inside her. "This is a trap, you know that, right?" Sophia said quietly, looking at Richard. "Of course I know that," he replied, his jaw set. "But we have no choice. We need to face it." The factory, an imposing structure of rusted iron and broken windows, exuded a sense of danger. As they passed through the main doors, a metallic screech echoed, and the shadows of ancient machines seemed to watch them from the gloom. In the center of the space, under the dim light of a hanging lamp, Victor waited for them. "You arrived just in time," Victor said with a sinister smile, as a pair of armed men appeared behind him. Richard took a step forward, placing Sophia slightly behind him. "What do you want, Victor? Enough of this game." Victor laughed softly, shaking his head. "What do I want? Revenge, Richard. Evelyn stole something that was mine, and now I'm going to get back what belongs to me." Sophia frowned, feeling fear give way to anger. "I'm not property, Victor. If you expect me to give myself to you, you're wasting your time." Victor looked at her with cold eyes, as if her defiance amused him. "You have her spirit, I admit. But you don't understand the value you have. Your connection to Evelyn and her fortune is my key to destroying what remains of the Bennetts." Richard gritted his teeth. "You have no idea what Evelyn went through to protect her from you, and I won't let you hurt her." Victor gestured, and one of his men stepped forward with a briefcase. He opened it, revealing a contract and a shiny weapon. "It's simple," Victor said, pointing at the documents. You sign this transfer of your property and accounts, Richard, and she walks away free. Otherwise, well, I have a limit to my patience. Sophia looked at Richard with worried eyes. Don't do this, Richard. This won't solve anything. Richard held his gaze for a moment before turning to Victor. If you think I'm going to give in to your threats, you're underestimating what we're willing to do. Suddenly, a metallic sound echoed from the other end of the factory. Everyone turned towards the source of the noise, and at that moment, police lights illuminated the place. Thomas had kept his promise to intervene at the right time. Put down your weapons, one of the officers shouted, entering with a group of armed agents. Victor backed away, furious, as his men were quickly disarmed. Before he could escape, Richard stopped him, confronting him face to face. It's over, Victor. Evelyn isn't here to protect us, but we're stronger than you think. Sophia watched as the officers arrested Victor, feeling a relief she hadn't experienced in years. But while the immediate threat faded, she knew the scars from this night would remain. Richard approached her, placing a hand on her shoulder. This is over, Sophia. Now we can start rebuilding. She nodded, although deep down she knew the road to healing was just beginning. The abandoned factory was shrouded in tense silence, following the police intervention. However, Sophia and Richard knew they couldn't relax just yet. Victor Kane had been handcuffed, but his cold, calculating gaze still conveyed danger. Even with his hands tied, he seemed to have one last ace up his sleeve. This isn't the end of it, Victor muttered as the officers escorted him to a patrol car parked outside the factory. Sophia watched from a distance, feeling a mixture of relief and fear. The man who had indirectly tormented her life was being arrested, but something inside her told her that she was not yet completely free from his shadow. Are you okay? Richard asked, approaching her. Sophia nodded slowly, though her mind kept reliving the tense moments of the night. I can't believe they finally caught him. Me neither, Richard replied, but we need to make sure he can't get away with it this time. Before they could continue, a loud bang shattered the calm air. An explosion echoed on the opposite side of the factory, sending out a shockwave that made everyone instinctively duck. Amidst the chaos, Victor took advantage of the confusion to slip away from the officers, with the help of one of his men who had managed to escape the initial arrest. Quick, over here! Richard shouted, grabbing Sophia by the hand as they ran toward a side exit. The chase began again, this time within the narrow corridors of the factory. Victor, despite being unarmed, proved to be a cunning and dangerous foe. As Richard and Sophia tried to stay out of his reach, the echo of footsteps and screams filled the space. We can't keep running, Sophia said, stopping abruptly. This has to end now. Richard looked at her, surprised by her determination. What are you saying? He's not going to stop until he gets what he wants, but neither am I. I'm tired of running, Richard. Before she could respond, Victor appeared at the end of the hallway, his expression fierce. Very brave of you to stay, Sophia. But this doesn't change anything. Sophia stepped forward, facing him. I'm not afraid of you anymore, Victor. I'm not going to let you control my life. Victor laughed, but his laugh was bitter. You think this is about control? This is about justice. Evelyn took everything from me, and you were the key to getting back what's mine. Richard gritted his teeth. You have no idea what Evelyn went through to protect her from you, and I won't let you hurt her. Victor gestured, and one of his men stepped forward with a briefcase. He opened it, revealing a contract and a shiny weapon. It's simple, Victor said, pointing at the documents. You sign this transfer of your property and accounts, Richard, and she walks away free. Otherwise, well, I have a limit to my patience. Sophia looked at Richard with worried eyes. Don't do this, Richard. This won't solve anything. Richard held his gaze for a moment before turning to Victor. If you think I'm going to give in to your threats, you're underestimating what we're willing to do. Suddenly, a metallic sound echoed from the other end of the factory. Everyone turned towards the source of the noise, and at that moment, police lights illuminated the place. Thomas had kept his promise to intervene at the right time. Put down your weapons, one of the officers shouted, entering with a group of armed agents. Victor backed away, furious, as his men were quickly disarmed. Before he could escape, Richard stopped him, confronting him face to face. It's over, Victor. Evelyn isn't here to protect us, but we're stronger than you think. Sophia watched as the officers arrested Victor, feeling a relief she hadn't experienced in years. But while the immediate threat faded, She knew the scars from this night would remain. Richard approached her, placing a hand on her shoulder. "This is over, Sophia. Now we can start rebuilding." She nodded, although deep down she knew the road to healing was just beginning. The abandoned factory was shrouded in tense silence, following the police intervention. However, Sophia and Richard knew they couldn't relax just yet. Victor Kane had been handcuffed, but his cold, calculating gaze still conveyed danger. Even with his hands tied, he seemed to have one. Richard stepped in, stepping between Sophia and Victor. "Your vengeance ends here. Evelyn isn't here to defend herself, but we're here to make sure you don't hurt anyone else." The confrontation reached its climax when the police, alerted by the explosion, surrounded Victor once again. This time there was no escape. Under the officer's orders, he was finally subdued and led away. Sophia exhaled deeply, feeling the weight of years of uncertainty and fear begin to lift. Richard at her side watched with pride. "You did it, Sophia. You faced your demons." She looked at him, her eyes filled with tears, but also with relief. "I couldn't have done it without you." With Victor finally out of her life, Sophia knew a new chapter was beginning. Although the wounds of the past wouldn't go away right away, for the first time in a long time, she felt like she could begin to heal. The Bennett mansion was bathed in the warm light of the morning sun, a stark contrast to the tense night Sophia and Richard had faced over the past few days. The air was calm, almost promising, as if the house itself was breathing a sigh of relief after the chaos. Sophia stood by one of the windows in the main hall, looking out over the gardens. Her face held a serenity she was only just beginning to discover. Though the scars of the past still remained, she knew she was finally in a place where she could begin to heal them. "It's a good day for a new beginning," Richard said as he entered the room, holding 2 cups of tea. Sophia turned to him with a small smile. "I guess so. It still feels unreal, but I think I can breathe easy for the first time." Richard nodded, offering her a cup. "You have a right to feel that way. Victor is no longer a threat, and this house will always be open to you." She accepted the cup gratefully, but her gaze softened as she looked at Richard. "You don't have to do this, Richard. I don't want to be a burden on you." "Sophia, you have never been a burden," he replied firmly. "From the moment I found you, I knew there was something special about you. And now, knowing what we share, I feel like this is the right thing to do. Evelyn would have wanted you to have a home." Sophia felt her eyes fill with tears, but they weren't tears of sadness. For the first time, they were tears of relief, of gratitude. She had spent years surviving alone, not knowing that there was anyone willing to fight for her. "Thank you, Richard, for everything," she said quietly, her words full of sincerity. "You don't have to thank me. This is just the beginning," he replied with a smile. Later that day, the two walked through the mansion's hallways, now brighter and more lively. Richard shared his plan to turn a portion of the property into a foundation to help street children, a project that resonated deeply with Sophia. "I want you to be a part of this," Richard told her, as he showed her an empty space he planned to transform into offices for the foundation. "There's no one better than you to understand what they need." Sophia looked at him, surprised. "Are you sure?" "I've never been more sure of anything in my life," he replied. Sophia nodded, feeling a new spark of purpose ignite within her. For the first time, she could imagine a future where she not only survived, but helped others find a way. The Bennett mansion, once a symbol of secrets and pain, was beginning to transform into a place of hope and new beginnings. As the sun set, Sophia and Richard stood in the gardens, watching the golden light envelop the house. "Sometimes endings are just the beginning," Sophia said with a genuine smile. And so, with the past behind them and the future full of possibilities, they both began to write a new chapter. Together. History teaches us that sometimes facing the past is the only way to find peace and build a better future. Richard and Sophia had to overcome fears, discover painful truths, and make difficult decisions to protect what really matters. Now I ask you, if you were in Sophia's place, facing an enemy who knew your darkest secrets, what would you have done? Would you have trusted Richard or run away on your own? Click on the video above to continue exploring this incredible story of self-discovery and courage. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss more content like this. See you in the next video.